Logan, 22 WTF moments in Wolverine's final stand. So what universe is this, exactly? It's almost impossible to conceive it, but the same studio who have mishandled Fantastic Four twice and who were widely criticized for their latest mainline X-Men movie have scored one of the biggest wins of the year, and it's still only March. Just try and imagine a world where two R-rated Fox/Marvel comic book movies released in the early months of the year, traditionally a graveyard for blockbuster turkeys, are the most widely beloved movies of 2 consecutive years. Deadpool was good in 2016, but Logan might well be the most jaw-dropping achievement in comic book movies of all time. It's not quite as epic as The Dark Knight, or as pulpy as Captain America: Civil War, but it is braver than both, very possibly better directed than both, and absolutely more brutal. It is heartbreaking, exhilarating and hauntingly memorable, and even with 2 of the X-Men's finest players retiring in it, it feels like the satisfying end to a great chapter. And while it's almost an anti-comic book movie, Logan knows its place in the genre, even as it invents new opportunities and opens darker, braver doors. Which means it's still full of Easter eggs to go alongside the weird, wonderfully and downright jaw-dropping moments. It might be more realistic, more adult and more grim than any other comic book movie ever made, but that doesn't mean it isn't bursting with WTF moments. 22 The Deadpool teaser. Where else could you see Stan Lee, Ryan Reynolds' bare backside and Easter egg nods to Ariana Grande, Firefly and St. Elmo's Fire? The teaser short for 2018 sequel might not have been the world-exploding cameo we were all first told it would be, but it offered 3 minutes of outrageous, hilarious insanity, lampooning comic book movies in general and Logan and Superman, of all characters, in specific. Putting aside all of that other oddness, which you can put down to Deadpool's inherent weirdness, the fact that a Marvel movie includes even a cursory nod to a DC film is pretty jaw-dropping in 2017. But you'd have to think that if anyone could have pulled it off, it would be Deadpool. 21 Days of Future Past did nothing. X-Men movies have a problem with their timeline, to say the least. The franchise is a mess of holes created by the convergence of 2 different timelines, which were gleefully married with no thought for what it would do to continuity. Day of Future Past was supposed to be the mender, bringing the timelines together to a fixed future point that was all happiness and restored relationships where nobody was dead and Nicholas Hoult grew up to be Kelsey Grammer and all was right with the world. Somehow, with that lovely future happening in 2023, the world went to complete hell for the mutants in just 6 years, in which period, a virus wiped out mutant kind, the X-Men were killed in the Westchester incident and Wolverine aged about 30 years. There were claims that this is different timeline entirely, but that simply is not the case. This film follows on from X-Men Origins and the first X-Men at least, hence the mention of the Statue of Liberty. 20 Wait. Xaviar has hair. It didn't look a great deal like it in some of pre-release marketing materials, but Professor X has hair, wispy and sparse though it may be, but it's definitely there. But Xaviar shouldn't have hair, since X-Men Apocalypse established that he lost his hair thanks to the villain's attempt to steal his body. Quite why taking on Apocalypse's powers leads to total hair loss, though not eyebrows, remains unexplained, but it's very firmly established that his baldness isn't merely a fashion statement. So how the hell did it grow back? 19 Taco Bell's product placement. When Professor X is first introduced in his water tank prison, he's garbling quotes, visibly affected by the deterioration of his brain. He appears to be quoting the dialogue from a Taco Bell commercial, which is as weirdly funny as it is tragic. You have to wonder how much that particular bit of product placement cost the fast food giants? And come to think of it, why doesn't this behavior ever manifest itself again at any point? Was he just putting it on? Okay, so Caliban does say he's having a bad day, but wouldn't being on the road, hunted by anti-mutant mercenaries and displaced entirely have caused some stress and led to more bad days? It just seemed like a convenient way of making him look bad without a real follow-through. 18 Xaviar gets Wolverine's origin wrong. You can forgive an old man for getting a few details, particularly when he's suffering from a degenerative brain disease, but having him misremember Wolverine's origin as an X-Men is just careless. Particularly as it's stated as irrefutable fact and in a context that requires total truth to convince Logan to do as he's told. Xaviar claims that when the X-Men found him, he was training to be a cage fighter, which is only partly true. He was a cage fighter in bars, but he wasn't training and he wasn't found by the X-Men. Rogue accidentally stumbled across him and he took her back to the X-Mansion. Xaviar is literally claiming credit for something that didn't happen. 17 The X-Men Comics. It might have been spoiled in the trailers, but it's still completely disarming to see X-Men comic books within the movie itself. It's like James Mangold is consciously breaking the first rule of adaptation. But it makes a lot of sense that superheroes would inspire that sort of fandom, and it's a nice revelation that the comics are effectively historical records of their heroics. It's still a bit of a kick in the teeth for comic book purist fans, as Logan's dialogue takes a firm swipe at how silly comics are. They're presented as a source of hope, and also filled with lies, but confusingly it turns out that the promise of Eden in the comics actually correlates to a real place of sanctuary for mutants. So they're both untrue and true at the same time, which is a little difficult to accept. 16 Reavers are the worst mercenaries ever. From their first appearance, the Reavers are billed as a fearsome force who were at least partly responsible for taking down the mutants who survived the Westchester incident. They've all but eradicated them, including other mutant supervillains, presumably, and yet when it comes to firing in a straight line at either Logan or Laura, they're absolutely hopeless. There's no way these bungling, stumbling idiots would have been able to kill off any mutants, particularly as their biggest weakness seems to be holding onto their limbs. Seriously, how many arms get cut off? And why, in the final climax, do they fail so hard to deal with the mutant kids? They don't have healing factors, and yet the heavily armed, muscle-bound marks never consider shooting them to take them down. Why would anyone trust them with high-profile targets? 15 clones who look nothing alike. Maybe it's nitpicking to say it, but how come Logan and Laura look absolutely nothing like each other? Even Professor X challenges Logan when Laura first appears, asking whether she reminds him of anyone. Why would she? At this point, we know she has claws, which can be the only similarity Xaviar is alluding to, but she couldn't look any less like Logan if she tried. That's not necessarily to say she should have had Hugh Jackman's face digitally merged into hers, but at least try and explain why none of the mutant kids actually look like the sources of their DNA. 14. How could this Caliban have been a villain? When Caliban is taken into custody by Donald Pierce, after Wolverine idiotically just stamps on Pierce's head and assumes that will be enough to guarantee the pacifist comic relief Caliban isn't threatened, it turns out that he used to work for Alkali Transigen as a tracker, and help them find and capture other mutants. It would have made a hell of a lot more sense if they'd had Caliban revealed as a former prisoner of Transigen who was forced to track the mutants. Because there's absolutely no way anyone could possibly believe that this lovely, maternal figure who cares so tenderly for Logan and Charles, albeit with a few grumbles, could have ever chosen to be a villain. It just doesn't fit the character's makeup at all. 13. Why didn't the nurses call for help? If Gabriella had time to film and cut an entire video charting the plight of the mutant guinea pigs, she, or one of her co-workers, surely had time to go to the authorities. Even if the American government were in on Alkali's evil plot, there are potential allies in Canada, and if the nurses can get their hands on $20,000, they clearly aren't entirely cut off. Or maybe just tell the press. The X-Men still have fans, so not everyone is anti-mutant in this future. Surely they'd have something to say about mutant children being reared as animals. Incidentally, Alkali Transigen deserve everything they get for hiring real nurses and not expecting them to care for their subjects. Wouldn't hiring a group of support workers who weren't subject to the Hippocratic Oath have been a better way of making sure the kids were treated like experiments and not real people? Maybe then they wouldn't have learned humanity and rejected their prime directives to be weapons. For a company run by super-intelligent villains, they aren't the smartest organization in movie history. 12. The slow emo kill fest. When Professor X's powers manifest as a seizure for a second time and freeze 400 people at the Hana Casino Hotel, definitely or long enough for them to die, since Wolverine has enough time to get to the room, some distance away, the Reavers are frozen as they close in on Charles and Laura. What happens next is one of the single most stunning, most brutal sequences in comic book movie history as Logan is able to resist the seizure and slowly claw his way back to the room. Horribly, brilliantly, the Reavers are then fully aware of him right up until the point he stabs his claws through their skulls in slow motion and with excruciatingly visceral effect. Nothing will ever have this impact on film again, it's simply jaw-dropping. It's also just sort of glossed over, but apparently Professor X is actually in control of the seizures, which suggests rather ominously, and probably accidentally, that he might have been in control when he killed the X-Men. 11. Xaviar's weird inconsistent powers. So, when Xaviar has a seizure, it freezes everyone, but not their eyes, and makes car alarms go off as if implying it has some sort of effect on electrical equipment in the close vicinity like an EMP weapon. And yet, Logan is able to use an elevator after slowly walking through the casino with all of its slot machines still functioning. His seizures either have electrical effects or they don't. Also, how come he's able to calm down the Mutants' horses when they crash despite being on the mind-limiting medication that is supposed to make him catatonic? And how come the injections designed to calm him, and send him to sleep, at no point actually send him to sleep? 10. Where did all the other mutants go? After the seizure event at the casino, a radio newscast reveals that the similar Westchester incident injured hundreds of people and killed others, including 7 of the X-Men. That barely even accounts for the entire X-Men team, let alone all of the mutants in the world. So where did the rest of them go? Xander Rice's monologue reveals that Alkali used corn syrup to sterilize the existing mutants and kill off future generations, but are we to believe that the whole generation simply died of old age? That's unlikely in a couple of decades, and it's not like the Reavers could believably have taken them all out. If the Westchester event inspired an uprising against mutants and a cleansing regime by ordinary people, why wasn't it shown? It would have added a more tragic note to Xaviar's story, and the lack of explanation just looks like a missed detail. 9. The weird farmland subplot. It's hard not to feel like Logan is trying to preach against the dangers of energy drinks and the corporate stranglehold corn syrup corporations have over the world. It's almost like a PSA dropped into the narrative with only the flimsy explanation that it was used as the primary means to infect the mutants with Transigens virus. When you think about the film's link to Shane, though, it makes more sense, as the classic Western also has a farming subplot that sees the innocent farming community terrorized by violent, uncompromising landowners. In that respect, the whole Munson subplot feels like a love letter to Shane. But it's still very distracting all the same, particularly when it is killed off so abruptly when X-24 appears. 8. The overzealous Foley artist. Movie gore offers the kind of opportunity Foley artists dream of. There's bucket loads of bone crunching, squelching and gushing of blood to really stretch their imaginations to come up with practical ways to make the scene sound disgusting. But you really have to draw the line somewhere, and someone really needed to rein in the Foley artist who added the sound effects to the low-key dining scene with the Munsons at their farm. Because the disgusting horror movie squelching of the corn Laura spoons out is plain ridiculous. It sounds like she's scooping out brains, and it wouldn't at all be surprising to discover that the effects worker was handed entirely the wrong scene spec sheet. 7x24. Even with some rumors that there was going to be another Wolverine clone before release, the revelation that Transigen also created X-24 as an improved weapon landed like a sledgehammer. Once more, Hollywood proved that de-aging technology doesn't have to look a travesty, and we got to see a brief performance of Wolverine in his purest, most animalistic form. And the jaw-dropping reveal worked perfectly in building to Xaviar's horribly heartbreaking death. That twist genuinely inspired gasps as Professor X waxed lyrical about how perfect their evening had been, and it was a reaction that was utterly earned. His reveal was a masterclass in bait and switch, pure and simple, and even if what followed was a little silly, that entrance moment was one of the best in the entire film. 6. The idiot cowboy Hicks. How exactly don't the Canewell farmers and their redneck muscle not realize that the Wolverine clone at the Munson's house is not the same one they met on their land at the water pipe? Sure, they both look like Hugh Jackman, but they're wearing entirely different clothes, they have different hair, are visibly a different age, and are very obviously not the same person. Those Hicks absolutely deserve to die, even if Mangold seems to have taken a little too much relish in killing them off. Ultimately, their lack of intellect makes it look a little like they've been dropped into the film as a vehicle to show off X-24's rage. Without them to slay, he would have only killed Xaviar and the Munsons, and the director clearly imagined that adding some cannon fodder would serve his mythology build. 5. The kids give Logan a trim. How is it that the mutant kids are able to take several pairs of scissors and cut Logan's beard, mere millimeters away from his nose and mouth, without triggering his notoriously animal protective instincts? Have his senses really dulled that much? And seriously, who even does that? They barely even know this man, they can have developed no feelings of paternal affection for him, and yet their first real act is to cut his beard for the lols? It's weird and ill-fitting, and it looks like an excuse for him to get his old man Logan look for an added tie to the comics. 4. Wolverine, fastest man alive. You shouldn't have trouble believing that Logan could run at near Flash levels of speed after he's taken the whole bottle of Transigen super serum, but how is it that after spotting the Reavers closing in on the children in the forest, a good couple of miles away, since the border is established as 8 miles away, he's able to catch up before they get to the kids? He's heavily injured, dying, in actual fact, has a limp and is still bleeding profusely from his first meeting with X-24. And yet he's able to beat cars driving at a healthy speed to the kids in the forest. Unless the Reavers took a serious detour to allow him to make up the ground, they would have packed the kids up well before he'd even broken the edge of the forest. 3. The useless weapons. Even assuming that the mutant kids rejected their prime directive of turning into weapons, they were subjected to rigorous training designed to make their powers dangerous to their possible enemies. That much was established by the sequences showing them resisting and in some cases attempting to escape. So why did the kids revert to innocent, terrified youngsters when they were confronted by the Reavers in the forest? Why didn't they turn and face them, knowing they had been conditioned to fight to the exact same degree that Laura had been? Sure, she had the advantage of her claws and a healing factor, but if the mutants had simply stood their ground, their powers would have been more than enough to stop the Reavers in their tracks. Instead they just make it more difficult for Wolverine to save them and he ends up dead. 2. Killed by Mother Nature, twice. The sequence that sees the mutant kids eventually realize they need to use their powers against Donald Pierce is easily one of the most haunting sequences in comic book movie history. Watching him slowly strangled to death by long grass is as horrifying as it is fitting. That's putting aside the fact that there's no way Alkali Transigen would have chosen a mutant capable of growing grass really long as one of their weapon subjects, of course. And then Mother Nature takes another scalp when X-24 dumps Wolverine onto a tree stump and kills him, as if that would be the final fatal injury for a character who has just spent a good portion of the last act being sliced to bits. Was this all an ecology warrior movie all along? Was this the natural conclusion to the warnings about corporate farming and corn syrup? That too much energy drink consumption will lead to your heroes being killed by trees? 1 adamantium bullets would do nothing. Fox might really wish that we would all forget that X-Men Origins was a thing, but Logan actually acknowledges the film's existence and its part in James Howlett's transformation into Wolverine by reintroducing the adamantium bullet that Stryker developed as a means of putting Wolverine down. In doing so, it also acknowledged that it would be an impractical means for Logan to kill himself, or Laura to kill X-24, come to that. We could sit and debate for hours over the likelihood of adamantium being able to pierce adamantium. Scientifically, it's impossible, but the films establish at various points that it's not and that logic trumps science, but there's no getting around the fact that it wouldn't be fatal. In Origins, Stryker shoots Wolverine in the head, and all that happens is severe amnesia, which Xaviar can eventually get around to open Logan's mysterious past to him. And while we could put him believing the bullet to be an effective means of suicide down to him forgetting being shot by one, there's no getting around the fact that the same bullet explodes X-24's head like a pumpkin. Where's the consistency? What other WTF moments did you spot in Logan? Share your favorites below in the comments thread.